of the dangers of this moment is this co-opting of this language of Black Lives Matter by institutions immediately when all these corporations like send out Black Lives Matter statements and all these universities sign pledges and whatnot, which isn't about finding housing for Black people. It's not about abolishing prisons. It's not about dealing with violence in our homes, or it's not about resourcing us. It's not about reparations. It's not about any of the things that are actually on a liberatory agenda.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
This is Propa-Ganada. Welcome to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly but politely challenge corporate power in Canada. This is episode 9. Thank you so much for tuning in. In this interview, I speak to Elle Jones, who's an award-winning poet, writer, community activist, and journalist based out of Halifax, as well as she's a professor at Mount St. Vincent University. And in our conversation today, we talk a lot about structural racism in Canada and how the power elite try to reframe Black Lives Matter movement as one where, rather than actually addressing structural racism and the economic factors that underlie it, the conversation tends to get pushed more towards how do we get more racialized people in places of power and, CEOs, government, board of directors. And so I hope you enjoyed the show. Please like, subscribe, and comment to the channel if you enjoy it, and obviously share with your friends. The more we share it, the more this message gets out. And I guess I'm wondering from your standpoint, from the community work you do, from the people you're connected with and who are incarcerated, when you see politicians, corporate leaders paying lip service, using the lingo, but you don't see actual systemic things changing, or I'm guessing, I'm wondering, what are your views on that?
I'm just going to read you. I made a status today. I'm just trying to find it. So I said today, it's amazing how quickly the Canadian state and its collaborators, both white and Black, were able to shift the focus of the mass movement of Black protests from justice and state violence to banking, entrepreneurship, and finance. That was my last post. So notice how the last budget was all about Black business, and the bulk of money, not that we get any money, I would say this is like the rounding up on garbage day, when they want to change garbage day, they do a study and it's the rounding error in that study is what they give Black people across Canada.
Wow.
200 million, across all Black Canadians. But, the last few investments have been in Black business, Black entrepreneurship. That post was prompted by the head of the Bank of Canada is giving a talk for the Atlantic universities on how the financial sector can have diversity and inclusion, and that's obviously peak neoliberal, right? But we've seen this through things like Black North Initiative and these other things where immediately we didn't even get a second on the ground to talk about policing before everybody was making it about university boards and people in the boardroom and Enbridge giving money and complete. So and this is within the Black community as well, right? Because there's obviously Black capitalists. Again, it's not, Jay-Z bragging about being a Black billionaire. We have this discourse. People have been critiquing Patrisse Cullors lately because of taking all this money out of the movement and buying 5 houses, not accounting for $90 million, giving a donation, and the families that actually experienced the trauma saying what about us? You're using our names, and it's not about money, it's about you're not even giving us justice, right? You're doing, so this is always an issue, and it's not new. Think of all the Black Democrats that came through the civil rights movement and then voted to weaponize the police that directly led into Ferguson. And yes, people like John Lewis, right, that are civil rights heroes, but then went on what Black Agenda Report calls the Black misleadership class, right? That have very consistently, which is not unique to Black people. Indigenous people talk about this with the chief system, right? So I don't want to suggest that Black people are worse. I'm suggesting that this is capitalism, right? And there are many, many Black capitalists, and there are many, many Black people who believe in representative politics, which has sort of reached this apotheosis, I can't talk, in the Biden government, where it's Raytheon, he's Black and we're appointing it, all awful neoliberals that we're supposed to celebrate because they're women or queer or black. And then whenever there's critique, you're called racist or sexist. I got called a Russian troll for like the first time for critiquing Biden, you know? So like that's always been the case, and it happened in the feminist movement as well. But one of the dangers of this movement is exactly this, or of this moment, is this co-opting of this language of Black Lives Matter by institutions immediately when all these corporations like send out Black Lives Matter statements, and you know all these universities sign pledges and whatnot, which isn't about finding housing for Black people. It's not about abolishing prisons. It's not about, you know, dealing with violence in our homes, or like it's not about resourcing us. It's not about reparations. It's not about any of the things that are actually on a liberatory agenda. And so that's frustrating, right? Because what we're seeing in this moment is sort of those who are in the position to get theirs can get theirs through like a new diversity consultantship. But the mass of Black people are still living in housing, still, you know, facing adverse health outcomes, still getting suspended from school. You know, working class Black people aren't getting any changes. Like even with this, you know, government entrepreneurship funding, I'm like, you don't mean a Black woman braiding hair in her house. You're not counting that as entrepreneurship. Like the single mother who takes in other people's kids to watch, like you're not funding them. You're not counting that as business. It will be Black people with MBAs that are in a position to get this money. The other day I was looking into this thing, like the government is partnering with Habitat for Humanity to create 200 homes for Black people, and it's like a $42 million budget. Is like what? Like, you know, it's just so, you know, we have all these and very much increasingly like these financial based initiatives, and of course the Black Lives Matter movement is about policing and justice and state violence, and that's being left behind almost entirely, other than like Justice Bill C-22, which we know isn't really for Black people. C-22 is the bill that, you know, decriminalized some small forms of possession. We just got this, right? That certain possession is decrimmed, but cops and courts still have discretion. And we know that means they'll continue to charge Black people, they just won't charge white people. And they eliminated like a few mandatory minimums. And at the time they said they weren't gonna like eliminate mandatory minimums as a whole because they needed them to combat gangs. And sure enough, then Bill C-21 comes out like a week later, and that's guns, drugs, gangs. In other words, all the Black stuff, the border. And they're like, oh, we have a new firearms regulation. I'm like, that's basically reassuring white people. Don't worry about Bill C-22. That's for your white kids to not get charged with weed. But these Black gangsters, we're cracking down on them. So I'm like, Bill C-21 is a direct response to Bill C-22. And the idea that this government was like soft on crime. So they're like, no, we're soft on middle-class white crime, but don't worry, we're going to still prosecute the war on drugs with these gangsters. So like, we're not going to engage with what the war on drugs looks like in terms of policing. Every municipality across the country is like refunded the police, despite, you know, the big defunding movement. So yeah, I mean, it's frustrating a lot in this moment because obviously, because of white supremacy, we have an ethos in the Black community that we're not supposed to critique each other in public. And as we get more people in positions of power, like it's 2021, right? That is changing. We have Black people on boards of governors. We have Black banking executives. We have, you know, Black politicians. And this idea that now we can't critique them out of Black solidarity is harmful to us, right? It's harmful. And that's sort of the problem right now. I don't think we've learned to cope with the notion that Black people can be part of and are part of the power structure. And identity politics, not in the way what right-wingers use it, like talking about racist identity politics, but in the way that people critiqued Obama, right? This use of the neoliberal system of elite identities in order to paper over the fact that the state is violent towards Black people. We're very much living through that, and it's frustrating and it's hard. So, you know, even with the justice space, like a lot of people, and I knew this was coming. I was always saying this for years. I'm like, justice is going to get hot. And then like people go, well, you know, why do you care? Like you can do your work. But you actually can't, because people come into your lane and then they sit at the table and say really destructive things. Like, we need Black halfway houses. You're like, no, we do not need Black halfway houses. Those will become supermax halfway houses that prevent Black people from getting community release. You know, like we need more Black guards and wardens. Like, no, we don't. We need to get rid of prisons, you know? So people who are often are brand new because they're neolibs that haven't like paid any attention to radical discourse and don't agree with it and aren't part of it, now consult with government and say horrible things like we should like have work programs for housing and, you know, things that are just being like disproven. And that's really hard because then you're like, even now I'm talking about it, it's like, oh, you're attacking all these other Black people. I'm like, no, I'm backing bad policy that has already been proven not to help Black people. And if you haven't been paying attention to justice, like, please don't come through in 2021 talking about how we need body cameras when we're trying to defund the police. And like 10 years ago, we figured out the body cameras didn't work. So
they're used against people a lot of times too, right? It's extra evidence.
Yeah. And like the ability of Black people, right? That people think any Black face is the same Black face, right? I include myself in people who benefited from this moment, I guess, because I just got a job, like a full-time job. But, for years, I couldn't get a full-time job because like nobody wanted this kind of radical discourse. If I did data-driven research on like how Black cops experience racism, I'm sure I'd have had a job 10 years ago, But now we're in a moment where suddenly this stuff has become trendy, and then all those people have jumped in order to benefit. And it doesn't benefit the people who are actually living in prison, the people who are actually living in shelters, the people actually being policed by the cops for drug use or for homelessness or for mental illness. Like, that's what we need to focus on. And so it really bothers me that we've shifted so far away from the state violence, critiquing capitalism, understanding consumerism. Like, we were property. That is the underlying relationship of racism and capitalism, right? As Eric Williams told us 70 years ago more than that, almost 80 years ago, in Capitalism and Slavery, capitalism gave birth to slavery. It's not the other way around. People needed labor and they created an ideology to support Black labor. Like, that kind of leftist discourse has been very absent in this moment.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Elle, because something I'm thinking about a lot is like, I always think about when Malcolm X went for the Hajj. When Malcolm X, who, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my understanding, is he had previously, his kind of education was that white people inherently are racist, and that there was something kind of fundamental in being white that meant that you did not like Black people. And when he went to the Hajj in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, and he saw all these Muslims of all different types of colors, skin colors, and he saw them all being treated each other as brothers and sisters, and he realized, oh wait, this is something that's been institutionalized and ingrained and put into our brains in the West. So this is, and other countries, I get like England and Ireland, right? Like the imperialism of England and Ireland, they had to create anti-Irish. So the psychology of when you need to get a bunch of people to do something horrific to another group of people, you need to find an ideology, as you were just saying about racism, to justify that. And again, my wishful thinking is that humans don't naturally act that way. So you have to create some kind of ideology to dehumanize the other. And then only then can you take their land. Only then can you take their, you can institutionalize them, put them in workhouses or whatnot. And so for me, that gives me hope that like a baby human being is not born racist. It has to be ingrained in their brain. So when I see these reactionary right wingers or reactionary white supremacists, there's this little grain of hope that if it can be taught, it can be untaught. So I'm going to let you roll with that. That's a lot there. But what are your thoughts on the whole comment? Am I?
Yeah, no, this is the whole, obviously, like, whiteness is a construct that has changed relatively recently. So it's only at the really dawn of the 20th century that whiteness, as we understand it, consolidates. Now, people take this too far, as in, like, there's no racism because the Irish were, it's like, no. Like, the Irish as indentured servants are not something out of slavery. But, of course, the Irish are anti-colonial because they were colonized by England. So one of the things that happens historically is in Ireland, the Irish were always anti-slavery because they understood that their relationship to power, like the power of England, was similar to the relationship of Africa. Like, they made that connection. And then there's some good work on how when the Irish come to the Americas, for example, initially they're taking common cause with Black people, and there's like rebellions between the indentured laborers and the enslaved people who are recognizing like the common enemy is like this rich white boss. And part of the mechanism of racism is, of course, to tell that poor Irish person, poor white person, that your solidarity doesn't lie with this N-word. Right. It lies, at least you're all white. And if you get things for the white man, you can be, so like Irish people start participating in violence against Black people to stop Black people from getting the vote, for example. The early St. Patrick's Day parades are actually, violence, brutality being done against Black people, specifically because post-slavery, as Reconstruction is happening, there's a lot of rhetoric that these Black slaves are going to come and take your white man job on the, right? So you get the Irish laborers then engaging in violence against Black people, like burning down Black people in the docks and stuff. And there's an argument this is how the Irish earn whiteness, right? That whiteness is earned through consent to state violence. So as you become white, you become part of this domineering class and you commit violence to the people below you. So this notion of whiteness is, like Eastern Europeans, were they genuinely considered white when they, no. And what happens in America, like there's initially a big hierarchy. This is where WASPs are, right? Like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top. Ukrainian was not at the same thing, but as they're clearing the land and creating genocide against indigenous peoples, and they're fighting colonial wars in Samoa and the Philippines, it's like we need all white hands on deck, and people become white in order to create this. We need white pioneers to go settle, and so those Eastern Europeans get to become white. Whereas before we would have seen them as, lesser than us. So we have to understand that mechanism of power, right? And of state violence, and that, whiteness is granted to you to the extent that you're able to participate in violence against indigenous and Black people, primarily against, Muslim people, whatever is happening in the day as the national identity changes. So that is really important to understand that, class issues and race aren't separated, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the mistakes of perhaps the contemporary left, and this is exactly the bourgeois use of racial politics, right, which is to make it an elitist project and say, okay, we just need more bank executives, as opposed to actually dismantling the capitalist system that gives rise to racism and also screws over the poor white worker and the white person living in the rural region and the white person that can't access college. And that is often wielded against us as proof that racism doesn't exist. Also because people only get their information on race on Twitter, and they don't do any reading. So they think that this is what Black people actually think. So you get a lot of white discourse, like some 19-year-old kid said something on Twitter, and then it's as if this is the height and peak of Black intellectual discourse around race. As if we haven't had actual generations of our greatest minds being turned to this topic. What do we do in colonialism? How does power work? How does race work? So people are often having a sort of very superficial understanding of what it is. And this is where you get critical race theory held up as the new evil, Marxism is the new evil. So these kind of intersectionality is, people haven't read what they're talking about. It just becomes a soundbite. So that makes it difficult, especially in discourse in terms of how do we build solidarity. Stuart Hall talks a lot about this, right? The theory of articulation. So the idea that, Marx has a kind of deterministic idea, right? That there's two classes, there's the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat will develop class consciousness. They will inevitably rise up eventually against the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie continues squeezing you until your life becomes unbearable. You can't even buy the things you work for. So eventually, you're going to have to rise up. And of course, people have critiqued Marx, where does the management class come? And of course, one of those critiques is, do they? What about the workers that snitch out other workers? What about the workers that just want to become the manager and fire other workers? Why do we all revere, before Trump was president, he was on The Apprentice firing people. And why did working people losing their jobs watch and venerate that? Because you imagine you could be Trump, and it's a power fantasy. So you don't think this is evil. You're oh, Trump's amazing because he has this power, right? So Stuart Hall talks to us a lot about that with the same information. Why do some people become fascists and some people become socialists? It's not the case that the entire working class becomes socialist. Populist politics directly targets, people under this idea of immigrants are taking your job. Black people want too much. Indigenous people get to hunt and fish and you don't, right? And these rhetorics are powerful rhetoric. So part of the problem of the left, I think, has been that the right in many ways out memes us, right? The right works well with very simplistic narratives, right? Prisoners bad people. You need cops to come and get bad people. Authoritarian narratives that appeal to very those parts of ourselves that want an easy answer. And the problem is our answers tend to be complex, and that makes them sound intellectual. And I just had to explain, 500 years of history, talk about Eric Williams, who has the patience for that, right? So it's easier to reduce them. So being BLM are Marxist and they want to take your guns is easier than saying race is a complex feature. It was constructed through history. And let's reflect on that. So that's kind of the problem the left has had, I think. And then we get bogged down into simpler narratives for ourselves, language policing and those kind of things. It's harder to deal with these institutional historic issues, and it's harder to build that solidarity. So yeah.
Awesome. Elle, you're a fucking boss, dude. Thank you. All right. Nice to meet you, man. All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Keep in touch. Bye.
Yeah.